Hello, good evening. It is Jonathan Freedland here with a Guardian Live event and a very special Guardian Live event for our 200th anniversary, which you may have just picked up accidentally. It was marked last month. This evening, we are talking about this 7 ways, let's get that there, 7 ways to change the world by our special guest. He is known, obviously, to Guardian readers and to people all around the world, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1997 and 2007, now the UN Special Envoy on girls' education around the world, and between 2007 and 2010, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, last Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. Welcome, Gordon Brown. It is an
Hi,
absolute pleasure to be
good to
with
be here.
you. And we are, as I say, celebrating this rather extraordinary book because of its breadth, its depth, and its hope. And you may know that The Guardian's slogan is "Hope is Power." And this book really embodies it. It is full of hope. But I thought we're going to talk about it. We're going to have a conversation, you and I, for our first 30, 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to bring in people with their questions and have a conversation for the hour. But I thought it would be nice to begin, given that it is a very special birthday for The Guardian, to ask you about your relationship with this newspaper, with this institution, not really as a politician, because we all know that politicians often have very stormy relationships with newspapers. So you can get into that if you like. But I was almost thinking of you as a engaged citizen, as a reader, what your lifelong relationship, rather than only as a politician,
Yeah,
has been
yeah.
with The Guardian.
I think, Jonathan, it's right to take a moment to celebrate and to congratulate the Guardian. It's been operating under very, very difficult times: a pandemic, a re-elected Conservative government, the Queen's consort dies, the monarchy is at war with itself. The Prime Minister takes a new partner. Now, that was 1821. So nothing much has changed. That was Lord Liverpool. That was Queen Caroline. That was a pandemic of cholera. And as you know, they say the first 200 years of any institution's history is always the most difficult. Yeah, I remember actually the first time. You've got in your life there's certain points you remember, like your marriage and the birth of your children and everything else. But one of the things I do remember is the Guardian accepting my first article. And that was a big achievement, not because of the money. I didn't really want the money, but because you can get through to a progressive audience. And so, for all the ups and downs, and there have been downs as well as ups, I think the Guardian does a tremendous job as through this crisis. And of course, it survives because it's got brilliant columnists. And I don't think I'm flattering you when I say that you're at the lead of that. So it's great to be able to.
That is very, very kind, Gordon. I've got to ask what your first piece for The Guardian was on.
It was on Social Security cuts. So it was about the Conservatives trying to cut Social Security. And then, of course, we had Mrs. Thatcher giving the Sermon on the Mount, which is to the Scottish Church, trying to tell them that they had to adopt the market economy as in line with the teaching. The Good Samaritan, remember, didn't only have compassion; he had money. That was her great theme. And I was tearing that apart. I think, and I think that was the second or the third article.
Yeah, no, well, of course, that was a famous speech. Well, it is wonderful to have you as part of the kind of Guardian Fellowship, really. And I know you have written for us since leaving Downing Street. You've written for us often and often floated new ideas as you wrestle with them. You're one of those unusual figures who I think thinks in public. And that's what you've done with this new book, 7 Ways to Change the World. And there's obviously so much going on in the world, even just right now, that we want to talk about. But I do want to stay with the book. It's got this thread all the way through. It's got a defining theme that the way to change the world is for the world to work together, for global cooperation. That's the case you're making, even as you enumerate these 7 different problems. And I just thought we would start with one that is in a way really front and center in people's minds because it's going on right now. And you've been, on the airwaves speaking about it, and that is with the pandemic and suggesting that the only way through this is global cooperation. It struck me reading what you've been saying about it, that it is striking how little global cooperation there has been specifically on the pandemic. I don't think, and I know we're just days away from the G7, but I don't think there's been an emergency summit, for example, about coronavirus in the whole course of it, even if it would have had to have been a Zoom summit. It hasn't happened. Why do you think, what's your analysis of why there has been so little global cooperation on this truly global challenge, namely a pandemic?
You see, Jonathan, the reason I actually wrote this book was I started in the first month or two of the pandemic because I saw that this was falling apart. I mean, there was no cooperation, there was no exchange of information, there was no surplus supplies being passed from one country to another, there was no coordinated purchase of ventilators and vaccines, and we had vaccine nationalism later, and then before that we had medical protectionism. So I started writing it knowing that in 2008-9 we had some cooperation, and I wondered why things had actually gone wrong. I've got to tell you a story about 2008, though, because it does emphasize that leaders can actually fail. You know, I believe you've got to get to the heart of the problem first if there's a real difficulty, and you've got to be 2 steps ahead of events. So in October 2008, we had this financial breakdown. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. 18 out of 20 American banks were in danger. And so we had a meeting in Paris, and we had Sarkozy there, we had Merkel, the German chancellor, we had the head of the central bank, we had Barroso and all these people. I was there, and Berlusconi from Italy. And we talked for about an hour and a half, and the Europeans thought the Americans were the problem. And I was saying, look, the problem's going to come to us. We've got to deal with it. And then we sat and had coffee. And suddenly I had Berlusconi. He's saying, amateur, amateur, he's saying, c'est son amateur, in his sort of French. And then he turned around and he said, amateurs, he said, don't these people realize we have a press conference in an hour and none of them have brought a makeup artist? You know, and this was the height of the crisis. And what Berlusconi was worried about was how he looked on television. And I kept thinking, is that Boris Johnson always wanting to uncomb his hair before a press conference rather than thinking about the issues? But really, there was a failure of leadership last year. But there was also the real issue, I think, was nationalism, political nationalism. Every country for themselves. So, you know, since 2010, we've had protectionism, tariffs, walls, border controls. Then we had America first, China first, India first, and all this sort of displays of everyone for themselves and not working together. And, you know, here's an instance, if I may give it. In 2016, remember in the referendum, there was that poster, Breaking Point, which was a really gross, racist poster about Muslim immigrants coming into Europe. No women, no children there, all blanked out, just to give this impression of people coming in, invading your country. And it was rejected and reviled in Britain. But what I found when I started researching all these things, it reappeared in Hungary. Then it appeared in Spain. Hungary, where there's hardly any immigrants, and people say there are more anti-immigrant parties than there are immigrants in Hungary, it was exploited. And this anti-immigrant, isolationist, xenophobia, and you've got the ADF in Germany, Le Pen in France, Wilders in Netherlands, you've even got it in Scandinavia. And I feel that what's holding us back is that for some reason in the last 10 years, because of the failure of globalization, people have retreated into the silos. And Trump was a symptom of this, not just the cause of it. He was a cause, but he was also a symptom. And so the world actually was not able to find a way to cooperate. And so we've got to go back not just to failed leaderships or cosmetically improved politicians. What we've got to go back to, I think, is this ideology that has taken root in the last 10 years, surprisingly perhaps, because we thought nationalism was a 19th and early 20th century phenomenon, and that really has become the problem that has prevented cooperation.
Yeah, and you've got a very strong chapter about tackling nationalism and in a way supplanting it with patriotism, which would be a more benign force. Yeah. I want to get to that when we're in due course.
But I just want.
Yeah, you sort of channel George Orwell in that paragraph, in that chapter. But look, in all the challenges, your 7 challenges, and I think we're going to pick up certainly on some of them, as many as we can. But the pandemic is your starting one. You get into talking about the economy, the environment, education, poverty, inequality, and nuclear weapons. And I want to pick up on that if we get time. But just to take one, for example, on the economy, you can imagine all kinds of people saying, look, global cooperation would be nice, but it's not essential. Why can't, they would ask, I think, there'll be plenty of Guardian readers who think, why can't there be socialism in one country, as it were? There are, especially perhaps in Britain, after Brexit, there's things that Britain can do. Why does it really matter what other governments around the world do or don't do on something like the economy?
Because the growth of the economy depends on cooperation between countries. I mean, we've already seen trade from Europe falling into Britain, and our exports falling into Europe because there's less cooperation than there was. But if you look around the world, we're utterly dependent on each other for imports, for particular goods, whether it be computers or whether it be food itself. We are dependent on other countries. And so if you are interdependent and interconnected and integrated, you've got to find a way of working together. The problem is we've had an open global economy, but we haven't had an inclusive global economy, and we haven't managed globalization well. So the openness, if you think of the openness of the economy, it allowed the contagion to spread from the virus and the economic recession to spread around the world. And the openness allows inequality to get worse. It allows climate change, of course, to get worse as well. And what you need to do is manage globalization well. And that's why, just as in the 19th century, you had local government and it couldn't solve the problem, so you had to have national government taking responsibilities, so too in the 21st century, you've got national governments that cannot solve problems. Even the most powerful country in the world, America, can't solve the problems on its own, and it's got to work with other countries. And the big fear about America is that it was actually quite multilateral in a unipolar age where America was dominant. And now we're in a multipolar age, and it's still the case. I think even under President Biden, there is a fear that it acts unilaterally and doesn't act multilaterally. We've got to change the way we operate. Otherwise, we can't solve climate change. It's no respecter of borders. We can't solve tax havens. I mean, tax havens has been up in the news this weekend. You can't solve them without isolating these tax havens, and you've got to do it by coordinated international action.
So that's a very current example. People discovering even just today that Jeff Bezos, there were years where he paid literally nothing, not a cent in personal income tax, even with this, galactic fortune that was big enough to send himself into space, and he's not paying a penny. Your point is that even a government as mighty as the American government, even with someone like Joe Biden at the helm, he cannot tax Jeff Bezos unless governments in Britain, France, Germany, and all around the world agree to make no place a hiding place for tax dodgers.
No safe haven for tax avoiders. And we tried to solve that problem in 2009 during the financial crisis. And we had a huge row. The big row at the G20 when we were trying to solve the economic crisis in 2009 was over tax. Because Sarkozy and I wanted to isolate these tax havens and put sanctions on them. But the Chinese, of all people, who had this gambling den called Macau, didn't want to name any tax havens. And we had to get a compromise where we didn't announce it in our communique, but we got another organization to announce it later. But it's taken all that time, to exchange tax information so that people start to know who is evading tax. And now, of course, I'm afraid they make a decision last Friday and the rate's too low. So it's 15%. So there's still an incentive to be in the tax haven. Amazon's excluded because there's so many exemptions for companies with a particular rate of profit. And there's so many loopholes, I'm afraid, and Britain's asking for some itself, that this will only raise about 250 billion when my proposal in the book would raise 750 billion. Now, think of what 750 billion could do to solve the health, the education, and the other problems that have been left over by the crisis. This is a huge missed opportunity to get the money in that would allow us in poor countries as well as rich countries to spend on our public services.
Yes, I mean, in a way, your point is that the money is there. It's in the hands of people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and all kinds of people. It's just a matter of re-engineering the system so that, as you say, we can get that money in. Listen, I just want to imagine this: the reader who's reading the book and agreeing with everything as you're saying, and realizing that global cooperation is obviously the key here in all these areas: education, health, the economy, and so on. They're persuaded of that case, but then you wonder, how on earth do we get it, especially when the world around us appears to be moving, even with Biden rather than Trump, but overall appears to be moving in the opposite direction? And even for those of us sitting here in the UK, this thought came to mind while I was reading your book, which is when you were Prime Minister, Britain was in two unions that were about cooperation. One of them was the European Union. We are no longer in that. And the other one, of course, is the United Kingdom. And that is in some degree of peril. And you're joining us tonight from your home in Scotland. That is at least a live question, Scotland's place in the Union. In other words, the energy seems to be moving away from working together rather than moving towards more of it. And yet your whole case rests on the idea that if we're going to solve these problems, we have to cooperate.
Yeah, and this is the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Look, a patriot loves their country, your history, your traditions, and what you stand for. A nationalist is not someone who necessarily, if you like, loves the country, but will say they do, but the resentment of others is the key to nationalism. That's what Orwell was talking about. It becomes not Scotland and Britain, but Scotland versus Britain. And if you look at the news and how it's reported now, it's always Scotland versus Britain. And yet we have shared values and we hold so many things in common. I don't take away from the idea that there's tensions between Scotland and England at various times. I mean, I had an academic friend who went down to London, and he said that the first thing he said to break the ice was, "You must think of us Scots as very aggressive." And the reply was, "We don't think of you Scots at all." And I was putting him in his place. And I've told this story. I mean, I'm looking forward to the Scotland-England football match, but the first Scotland-England international I remember was in the early 60s. And here was Scotland playing England. It was only on the radio. And I remember it vividly, 9-3, England 9, Scotland 3. And it was a national humiliation. And we felt that we had let everybody down. And the goalkeeper was a guy called Frank Haffey. And things got so bad in Scotland because we felt so passionately about beating England on this occasion that he had to emigrate. And he left to go as far away as possible to Australia. And then 30 years later, Dennis Law, the famous footballer, met him in Australia. And Frank's first question was, "Is it safe to come back?" And he was told no. And that, so Scotland and England, there's a relationship that you've got to think about here. But my point is, if in the modern world we're interdependent, integrated, interconnected, and we know we are, if climate change and everything else crosses borders easily, you've got to find a way of working together. And so I think if you look at Scotland, 30% are for independence, 30% are for the union. There's 40% in the middle, and we've got to persuade the 40% of the middle what course of action to take, because they will decide the result, not the hardliners on both sides. And I want to persuade them that cooperation is better than this conflict and this division that now exists, which is actually damaging us all.
And look, and that's the Scotland case, but around the world, we see countries retreating. I think you have a very striking passage in the book about how many walls are going up around the world, physical
66
barriers.
walls, 66 walls, and not just the Trump wall, but in 1990, the Berlin Wall came down and people signaled that as the end of walls, basically. It was the age of walls was over. Since 1990, there's now 66 walls, 33 have been built. And they're building them now between different countries in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East and everything else. And this is just a symptom of not just walls, but you've got border controls, you've got immigration controls that are a lot tougher, you've got tariff recalls, you've got protectionist measures being taken everywhere. And I think that has become a symbol. And, one of the reasons is you and I, growing up, the loyalties we had were to, our workplace, our trade union, our religion, our faith, our church, our social club. And these have actually become less important in people's lives. And so nationalism has actually filled a void. And we've got to be very careful that we explain to people. Orwell said it was a moral effort that was taken to take, if you like, to stop, if you like, nationalism taking over from patriotism. And I think the positive aspects of patriotism are great. I think the negative aspects of nationalism are a danger.
Yes, I mean, at one point in the book, I'm going to mention this now, actually, while I think of it, which is if you're watching and you would like to put a question to Gordon Brown, you can do that. There's a Q&A button there. And I know questions have already come in. And at some point after the halfway mark, we will be putting those questions to Gordon Brown. I mean, at some point in the book, you do actually say that you now look back and think it was naive, your hope for more cooperation, given the surging presence of nationalism around the world. You're reflecting on a time some time ago, but I can't help but think here you are imagining big changes for the world, and yet even in Scotland, your home country, you are on, it's an uphill struggle to get people to cooperate with their nearest neighbours in England, and therefore to imagine that we can all around the world get people to shelve or suppress that nationalist instinct and replace it with one which is, yes, patriotic, but is about cooperation. I wonder how hopeful one can be.
Well, actually, if you do a poll in Scotland, you'll find that 75% of people want this cooperation. And what they feel, however, is that neither does the SNP nor the Conservative government want to cooperate with each other. So I think the popular will is like vaccination, there has been great cooperation to get vaccination because it's British purchasing and Scottish delivery for Scottish patients. And I think in other areas, people want to see cooperation. But I think we've got to stand back and ask why it is that nationalism in the 19th century and early 20th century was really about people's anger about cultural discrimination, about political exclusion, about economic exploitation. And you can't, and that's what fired the anti-imperialist movements, the colonial movements that led to the liberation of many countries. But you can't really say that that's what's happening in the 21st century as we go through this decade. And it's more that nationalism feeds on economic insecurity. People sense their country is not what it used to be. People feeling that politicians have let them down. People feeling that they haven't got the social standing they have. Maybe their jobs have changed in the way that they don't feel that they're recognized. People feel that government sometimes treats them as second-class citizens. And I think you've got to answer these problems if you're going to deal with some of the problems that arise that lead people to vote for nationalist movements right across Europe and right across the world. These are common complaints. The people don't take your views into account. People are not listening to me. I don't count for anything, do I? These people in London, whoever thought of that? You get all these sort of phrases coming out, and rightly so, people feel that government is at a complete distance from them, and we've got to do something about it.
Yes. You, I want to ask you about something which there's been a lot of talk about this week, which is a profile that appeared in the Atlantic magazine of Boris Johnson. And in the piece, he says that the argument of the piece is in a way that he is above all a storyteller, and he's constructed stories for people to believe in about the fate of the country. And at one point, Johnson is quoted saying, "We are creatures of the imagination." And there's a passage towards the end of your book when you almost seem to agree with that. And you say, "I learned from my own failure to communicate." You're very self-critical in that part of the book. And you say, "I learned that we must have stories that show rather than tell." What is the failure you have in mind there in terms of storytelling? And why do you think narrative is so crucial as a politician?
Well, I didn't get my message across, did I? I mean, I was pretty clear in 2009 that we had to deal with this crisis by running a deficit. That was the only way. When the private sector failed, the public sector had to come in. And I lost completely the argument on debt and deficits. And it's really interesting. It's taken 10 years for people to come to the view that we had in 2009, that you really have to run a deficit if you're going to get out of a crisis. But I was traduced, and I look, the newspapers were after me. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I didn't have popular support amongst the newspapers, but I failed to get my message across. I kept thinking in the 1930s, Roosevelt had a depression and he went out and did radio broadcasts, but who would listen to radio broadcasts? I thought, I could do television shows, but nobody would listen. So how did I get my message across? And that was a real problem before Twitter and before Facebook and everything else, because it wasn't really alive then. So I failed to get my message across. The result was austerity, I'm afraid, because we would never have supported that kind of austerity. And so for 10 years, I think Europe has had to live with austerity as well. And so I wanted to learn from my mistakes. And I think you have got to tell a story. And that I agree with Boris Johnson. I don't agree with the story he's telling, but I think you have to explain to people. And I use two instances in the book of my friend Jens Stoltenberg was the Prime Minister of Norway, and Jacinda Ardern is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and I know her too. And both of them had to deal with real tragedies where terrorists had basically, one terrorist in Norway and a group in New Zealand had slain large numbers of people in their country. And both of them did these amazing storytelling to the populations. I remember Jens Stoltenberg saying, he quoted a girl who said, "If that man can do this with hate, just think of what millions of us can do this with love." And he quoted that and said, "We've got to stand together." And Jacinda Ardern, she quoted one of the Muslims who had lost relatives, who quoted, "Peace be with you." And she quoted that to the population. And she told a story of how someone had reacted and said, "We must fight hate with hope, and we must fight hate with love." And these two politicians actually summed up for their country, for that moment, one of terrible suffering and tragedy. They gave people hope, and that's, I think, what the best leaders ought to be able to do. There was something of that, by the way, in 2015. If I just say this, remember the child migrants that we wanted to bring into the country that were left unaccompanied, and there was a big campaign in Britain run by actually Kirsty McNeil, whom I know very well, of Save the Children. And they said to people, look, you can talk about the indignities that these children are suffering, but the best way of doing this is appeal to British values, appeal to the fact that in the 1930s, Alf Dubs, who actually led the campaign at her request, had managed to come to Britain as a result of Sir Nicholas Winton bringing people out of Eastern Europe who were being persecuted by the Nazis as Jews. And that was the story they told in Britain. Say, be as good as you've been in the past. Stand up for the values that Britain's always believed in. And that's what persuaded people to change, force the government to change its mind. So you've got to tell a story. And I think telling these stories about what we are good at, what our values stand for, what other people have done to inspire people does make a difference.
What do you think is the story you would tell now?
I think the story I would tell now is of Alexander Solzhenitsyn has, he's very pessimistic about human nature, and he says that the line between good and evil runs not just through countries and through communities, but through the human heart. So you can say he's very pessimistic, but he has got this great phrase in his work called the bridgehead of good. And I think we've seen in this crisis the bridgehead of good, because we've seen nurses and health workers risk their lives to save lives. We've seen people go out of the way to help people who are relatives or people who are on their own in difficulty. And around the world, we've seen aid workers go to all corners of the world to get health and medical equipment to people. We've seen doctors, again, Médecins Sans Frontières and everybody helping people. So I think we've seen this bridgehead of good. And I think it's really building on that with social movement. And by the way, I think Black Lives Matters, I think Me Too, I think the climate change movements have all shown the possibility of human nature really standing up for principles that are about the best values, fairness, social responsibility. These are the best values that we can stand for. And so I'm actually encouraged, particularly by young people's response to this crisis. So while the politicians have failed, I think medical scientists and ordinary members of the public have shown just how much they care about each other. We no longer talk about there is no such thing as society. People know that there is such a thing as society. We've come to see that the NHS represents that in Britain during this crisis. Nobody's talking about privatising the NHS now. No Tory could get a hearing to do that. Nobody's also saying, like Mrs. Thatcher used to say, you can't buck the market. All this has changed because the market has had to be overruled so that we can actually keep people in work and keep people with food on the table. So I think things have changed. The question is, we are at a turning point, and the question is, will history actually turn? And I think we know what's wrong now, and we've got to find out what we can do right. And I'm trying to put forward, my chapters are saying, here is a problem. So I explain what the problem is. So in many ways, it's an introduction that I'm giving to myself, but also to the reader. Here's the problem of climate change. This is what it means. Here's the problem of tax evasion. This is what it means. But here's some solutions that I'm suggesting. Other people will have better ones, perhaps. And I say at the end, I look forward to hearing other people's better answers. But at least I'm putting forward some constructive ways of moving forward.
We've got so many good questions that have come in. I'm going to get to those, but just before we do, the book has got this extraordinary sort of scope, and it's full of, you've clearly spoken to the most informed people in all these areas. You've got the data points, you've got the arguments.
Well, I did speak to you, Jonathan. I spoke to you a few times.
You didn't pick up the phone, but you've got you've anticipated the counter arguments, expert views on nuclear disarmament and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think you can see the world more clearly now that you're not in Downing Street than you did when you were in there?
I think Tony Blair said a few weeks ago that you're most able to do the job on the day you're leaving because you've got all the experience of learning from your mistakes. I think you also need a time to reflect, and I've had a time to reflect. Look, the frustration now is that you can see what needs to be done. Look, on Friday, it's so obvious to me that the real problem the G7 face is they've got to provide the finance to vaccinate the world. It's not going to happen just by sharing doses or by temporary patent waivers, although that's really important. You've got to put up the money. I always knew that at these big meetings. Unless you put up the money to get something done, it won't be done. And my fear is on Friday that they're trying to escape the responsibility for putting up the money to vaccinate the world. Now, the G7 could put up 2/3 of it. We could get 11 billion doses of vaccines procured, but you've got to plan it as Britain did at a national level. We've got to plan it at a global level now so that everybody's vaccinated. Nobody is safe until everybody's safe. And so here's a historic opportunity. The richest countries in the world, they're sitting around the table, and the frustration is, I think I know what needs to be done, but I'm not sure I can persuade anybody to do it. Although, President Biden, I'm hopeful for, but he's got pressures within America as well. So you've got to have leaders that are prepared to talk to each other and really go out and persuade the world. But we could vaccinate the world within the next 12 months. Everybody could be vaccinated who is in need of vaccination. It's not that costly. It's about 30 pence per week per person in the United Kingdom, a very small price to pay to get rid of the disease and to get the economy back to work. And of course, we're about to get huge amounts of money from the International Monetary Fund. Britain's going to get 23 billion. We can pay for it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, frustration seems to be the word, really, Gordon. I have to say, listening to you, you've worked out what needs to be done. You've put it in here, and you're not in the room on Friday. And you sound to me like you want to be in that room. It's frustrating to be on the outside.
Well, I think if you think you've got an idea, you want people to listen to it. And I'm not arrogant enough to think I know the answers, but I do think there is something that's got to be looked at. If you're out of government, what you could have done in a few hours in government could take years. So we mustn't underestimate the importance of having a government that can actually do the kind of things that need to be done. And, when I see the state of the health service, which is really underfinanced, let's be honest, it's underfinanced. Social care has not been developed. Inequality has risen very fast in the last 10 years. Poverty amongst children is rising. Schools are not properly equipped now, particularly for the catch-up. And when you see all these problems, you do want to help people do them. Not me, but I want to help people make the changes that a younger generation of people can make.
So let me put to you the first question that's come in. You'll like this one. In my personal opinion, Gordon Brown is the best Chancellor and Prime Minister I have witnessed in my lifetime since 1974. What does Gordon feel the Labour Party must do to regain power?
Well, I think we've got to recognise that things have changed. Thank you. I didn't write that question myself. And I think the questioner is thinking of Harold Wilson, who I also thought was underestimated for what he tried to achieve. But we've got to recognise things have changed. You can't... I was saying the other day that I was at the first meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party in 1983 when Labour had lost so disastrously that people thought we would never recover. And Michael Foot came along to this meeting and he made this speech. And he said, I remember, he said, Bernard Shaw, on the night that he had put the first night of his play and he'd got a very bad review. And I remember him saying, the play was excellent, but the audience was poor. And that we cannot say to the electorate. And at another point, he said something like, when I was elected, the good people of Plymouth Devonport elected me as an MP in 1945, and then the bastards threw me out in 1950. And he was making the point, you've got to listen to the electorate, and you've got to hear what they're saying. But you've got to also recognise that we've got to change. I mean, there's no point going back and saying the 1997 manifesto was great or the 2019 manifesto was even greater. What you've got to recognise is that none of them are relevant to the problems we now face in the future. And I think, my economic policy after 1997, we were dealing with a problem of instability, stop-go economies, boom-bust, high inflation. We're dealing with a very different problem now, and we've got to find new answers. And I think there's an issue about the dignity of people. People do not feel they are treated fairly. One of the reactions in the north of England is that people do not feel that they are listened to. And we've got to make sure that we hear what is being said and we put forward an economic and social policy that is actually in their interests. And that means you've got to start from first.
Isn't it the case that Labour is almost culturally so out of sync with the voters that the people of the northeast of England could decide after 11 years or then 9 years to vote for a Conservative government over a Labour one? People in the very places you're talking about felt more in common with an old Etonian like Boris Johnson than with the British Labour Party. This is a huge kind of job of cultural reconciliation, but more than Jonathan, just policy programs, isn't it?
Well, you've got to understand the transmission belt was Brexit. I mean, people moved from Labour to Brexit to Conservative, and that was people's feeling again that they weren't being listened to. Take back control was the slogan that worked because people felt that they weren't getting enough control of their lives. Labour had been seen to be in power in local government and having its MPs for many years. But, I don't think it's so much a culture problem. I think it's about us unable to show that our values, which are about fairness and liberty and tolerance and social responsibility, we're not reflecting them in the policies we put forward in the way that people understand. I don't think people say the Labour Party's values are values that they now despise or reject or think are inappropriate. I think people want fairness. They want social responsibility. They want a society that protects their liberties and freedoms and where they've got some control over their lives. And we have got to shape policies. They won't be the policies of 1997, good as they were at the time. And they won't be the policies of 2019, much as people want to go back to that manifesto and tell Keir Starmer he's got to honour it. You've got to say, no, the policies are going to be the policies that are relevant to the 2020s, but they're policies not by ditching our values, but by translating them and reflecting them in new policies that are going to be different on the economy, different on society. I can see huge changes that I would want to see happen, but obviously it's for Keir Starmer and his team to work them through.
You've mentioned his name twice. How do you think he's doing? Does Keir Starmer look like a winner to you?
Keir Starmer is a man of great integrity, and I think when people see that, they will want to support him. I think the last year has been incredibly difficult for any leader who's in opposition. You'll see that in the elections that people who were in charge of the vaccination program were getting the votes, and I can understand that. But I know Keir when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as later a Labour Member of Parliament, and I saw Keir at work. I just remember one story. I'll just tell you, Hillsborough. The police were being criticised for what happened at Hillsborough. He was the Director of Public Prosecutions, under pressure, obviously, to do the right thing by the people who staff our services that provide law and order. But he insisted on meeting the victims of Hillsborough. Now, he didn't have to do that as Director of Public Prosecution, but he insisted on hearing their story. And of course, things followed from that. That's the sort of guy Keir is.
Yeah. All right. A question that come in. Looking back on your time as Chancellor and PM, are there any missed opportunities to address the climate crisis that you regret not taking? And your book does include a riveting account of the Copenhagen summit. But the questioner asks, are there any missed opportunities to address the climate crisis that you regret?
Well, we made mistakes, but I think everybody did. I mean, we misunderstood the relationship between diesel and petrol, and I think we took people down the wrong road there. And I think that was a mistake, and I think it shouldn't have been done. But all the scientific evidence was pointing in one direction, and now it points in a different direction. The problem at Copenhagen was, I thought after the G20 in 2009, where we'd underpinned the world economy by $1 trillion, people had saw the benefits of cooperation. I thought we would get a deal at Copenhagen. I was perhaps too naive. And so we got all the money in, agreed for the climate change fund. So we're putting up 100 billion to deal with climate change. And that was a huge initiative. But I didn't quite understand that China and India were not ready, and neither was America. None of them were ready to sign up to, if you like, ambitious targets for climate change. And so, the meetings were chaotic. I mean, there was no executive. There's 194 countries just sitting there. There was no form of government there. So we formed a small executive. But then what happened was the Chinese sent along their ambassador rather than their leader, and he got into a fight criticizing Barack Obama all the time. So it actually became it became so heated that we couldn't actually make much progress. And what I realized was none of these countries were ready to move as we wanted to move and as Europe wanted to move. And it took until 2015 to that to happen. But there is more possibility now. So you need the Green New Deal to create jobs. You need to force companies to disclose their carbon footprints. You need to have far tougher targets in the short term, because it's all very well saying net carbon zero 2050. What are you going to do to get there? And all these things have to happen, including the provision of climate finance. And that's made more difficult by Britain's cuts in overseas aid. And I think that's something of a tragedy this year, that we're trying to persuade people to spend more on vital global public goods, and we're actually cutting our money and spending less.
Yeah. Questioner sends in this question. How likely does Gordon Brown think it is that the UK will eventually rejoin the EU?
Well, I'm maybe in a minority on this. I mean, I will still argue for being part of the European Union. I do think that is the right course for Britain, and I do think that we should be leading in Europe and not leaving. My idea of the slogan for the European campaign was leading, not leaving, because I do think people need to be proud of their country, and being proud of your country by being a leading force in Europe, I think, could have won people's hearts and minds to staying in the European Union. Now we've got what's called Global Britain, and I think this is where we should put pressure on the government, because global Britain cannot be a glorified Hong Kong of the West or a Singapore of the West, where we come up sort of a tax haven and we become a deregulatory centre for anybody and everybody to come in. So we've got to fashion what a global Britain in the short term is going to look like. And I think it is about something that we've forgotten. You know, Churchill said we had three circles of influence: Europe, he said, America, and the Commonwealth. And that was right, of course. But there is a fourth circle, and that's the international institutions. And we should be playing a leading part in the United Nations, in the International Monetary Fund, in the World Bank. We should be shaping the agenda there with other countries. And we just seem to be out of that. And you really can't talk of global Britain unless we're part of that.
No, but I understand that, and that's a very good point about the campaign that should have been fought, but it wasn't, and the Brexit issue was lost. And so the question was asking, should Britain rejoin the EU? Not whether it was a mistake that we left, but should we now rejoin? And should people like you be campaigning for that rejoining?
Well, I want to rejoin the European Union. I'll not give up on my. Look, I didn't support joining the euro because I didn't think it would work for Britain. It wasn't because I objected to a single currency, but I just didn't think, given what I saw in the British economy, it couldn't work. So I'm not some mad integrationist that is in all situations will say integrate, integrate, and integrate. But I do think our future is still European. And I do think that myself, but I recognise that that's not what's going to happen in the very short term. And I also recognise that we've got to find a better way of expressing global Britain to persuade people of the need for international cooperation.
But you said before that one of the problems, and you write about it in the book, was that this sense that politicians don't listen and don't hear when they're given an instruction by voters. And I'm just wondering, if somebody like you were to make the case for rejoining, wouldn't those voters in Hartlepool and, you know, perhaps Batley and Spen and other places that voted for Brexit say, see, you still haven't listened to what we've said? And wasn't that perhaps part of Labour's problem in 2019?
Well, I accept I'm not the leader of the Labour Party, and I'm not the person that's putting forward the policy for the next election, and I will follow what Keir Starmer and his team decide. I'm only saying, as a personal view, I still regret leaving the European Union, and I still see a long-term future as part of Europe. And that's all I need to say. That's my contribution to the debate. I'm not there to decide Labour's policy at the next election.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of Guardian readers will be nodding in agreement, and they'll be delighted, frankly, to hear somebody say it, because people just aren't making that case. Interestingly, since we were talking before about story, one of the interesting things I thought, again, to refer to that interview with Boris Johnson in The Atlantic, he said Remainers failed because they didn't allow themselves partly to tell the romantic story of the case for Europe, namely of countries cooperating, coming together after a bloody century to work together. Instead, they frame the case in terms of, you know, pounds, shillings and pence that you would lose and fear, etc. It's quite an interesting argument.
Well, I phoned up David Cameron on two occasions, I think, and maybe more, I can't remember now. And I was just dismissed as being out of touch when I said, look, you've got to argue the positive case for Europe. You can't do a Project Fear. I actually didn't think it worked in the Scottish referendum, Project Fear, but he thought it did. And George Osborne, he was so convinced that they should fight on Project Fear and make people fearful of leaving Europe, that you had two basically anti-European campaigns. One that said that, you know, we didn't like Europe, but we should be part of it. And another one that said we loved Europe, we hated Europe and want to be out of it. And nobody was actually saying how positive a leadership role in Europe would be for Britain. And look, you know, what we did on international development together, what we've done on training of young people, Erasmus, the scientific program, we managed to keep the Horizon program, European Investment Bank, all these things were never really mentioned in the campaign, where cooperation was actually effective in creating jobs in Britain.
I know you were on the phone to David Cameron. Were you on the phone to Labour at the time to say Labour needed to offer that romantic message?
Yes. And I tried my best. I don't know if you remember this, but I did a video at Coventry Cathedral, and I said, look, you know, Coventry Cathedral, the ruins there were a sign of what happens when people fight each other. This is what happens when people can't cooperate. And out of the ruins of Coventry Cathedral, they built something new as a testimony to their desire for peace. And I used Coventry as an example of how people realized that the horrors of war had to be removed, and the only way to do it was by people actually working together. And Britain was responsible for the European Declaration of Human Rights. Britain was responsible for what Europe's done on international aid. Europe was responsible for some of the major reforms in the European Union. So I try to put the positive case for Europe, but obviously, I wasn't going to be listened to in the way that David Cameron or other people on the pro-European campaign or the campaign.
Yes, I think you had an idea that all living former leaders of Labour would do a joint event together, and that idea was nixed by Jeremy Corbyn and the leader.
No, I didn't actually advocate that. I do think both in Scotland and in Britain, it's really in a referendum. There's a real danger that you look as if everybody shares exactly the same view. I think you thrive on the fact that Labour people were arguing a Labour case for Europe, even if the Conservatives were arguing a different but not the same case, but they were arguing for Europe. And I felt that we didn't get a Labour case across during the European referendum.
Let's go back to the questions. How do you convince Scotland to stay in the Union when there is little sign of this disastrous government going anywhere anytime soon? Why would the Scottish people want to remain?
Because you can't make a decision about 300 years of history on the basis of one election or two elections even. You've got to think of the long term. You've got to think we're a more interdependent world. We've discussed this earlier. We're more integrated than ever before. Scotland's economy, just like England's economy, depends on the transactions between the two countries. Scotland has maybe 1 million jobs dependent on trade in one way or another with England. So there's an economic reason, but there's also a moral reason. You ask people about the National Health Service, and they will say the National Health Service is not just the Scottish or the Welsh or the English National Health Service. They'll say it's the British National Health Service. They'll say it's one central idea. Everybody free at the point of need, irrespective of the money you have. And that's a dominant idea across the whole of the British Isles. And everybody should be free. And this is what we should legislate. Anybody who's a British citizen can go into any hospital, to any doctor in the United Kingdom and ask for help. You shouldn't be restricted to being Scottish doctors for Scotland and English doctors for England. And I think we've got to strengthen the sense that when we cooperate, we actually do ourselves a service and that everybody benefits. Blood transfusion, when you give blood, do you ask, is that blood going to a Scottish, English, Welsh or Irish person? No, you're giving blood because it's a gift relationship to people who are part of the whole country. When you're signing up for organ donations or volunteering that there will be an organ donation, nobody's asking, is this for an English or a Scottish person? They're saying, where the need is across the whole of the country, we will help. And I think we've lost that sense that there are values that underlie our political system. One is empathy, that we feel we can put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand where they are. One is solidarity, that we feel there is common cause and we share the same interests. Another is reciprocity, that if you help me, I'll help you. Now, these are the values that underpin cooperation and sharing. And I think we've forgotten them. And it's probably because it has lasted so long with the health service and with the welfare state being British that we've actually forgotten what was the problems that existed in Scotland and England and Wales separately before these British institutions were brought into being.
Thank you. Another question comes in. What's your response to someone like me who believes it's far too late to reverse climate change?
I don't think it's too late. I do think it is late, however. One of the reasons that Elon Musk and all these people want to get to other planets is they think that this planet is beyond redemption. I always thought it was because of the desire to innovate and to go where man had never gone before. But they're actually saying, of course, as your questioner is saying, it's too late. But in my view, this is reversible if we take the action as necessary. Remember, the ozone layer was a huge problem in the 1980s, and then we dealt with it. So you can deal with a problem and actually bring it under control, but you've got to do so quickly. So COP26 is a vital moment. I mean, British leadership is under test here. And, I want to see the Green New Deal because I think that is the way to transfer the economy from being carbon dependent to being free of carbon. But I also want to see companies forced to disclose their carbon footprints because I think there's a lot of promises that are being made by companies. We're carbon free, we're planting trees and all that. Nobody knows exactly what's really happening here because there's no obligation to disclose in a way that is, understood by everybody and transparent. And then I think you've got to toughen up the targets. So it's no use saying that we're going to do something in 2035 if you're not doing something now till 2025. You've got to stages that show you're serious about taking action.
And again, I think you would suggest that the rich countries, the rich world needs to lead by example there and make the first big shift.
Yeah. Well, Europe, to be fair, has been a leader in this, but obviously we're going to need a carbon price at some point. We can't go on just not enforcing a carbon price, and that will have to happen. Europe's going to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so things will start to change. But I hope America and Europe and Asia will join in. This is one area. I have a chapter on China and America, and what one world, two systems. The danger of having two different systems. But on climate change, you can see America and China coming to some agreement.
Well, actually, let's bring the two of those together, because one questioner says, what prospects does the Biden presidency offer for renewed international cooperation on issues raised in the book? And then another asks, how do we deal with China as the new world power? Just on the Biden thing, I think there were a lot of people who did feel as if, look, all we had to do was get Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, and then things could, as it were, snap back to how they used to be when Barack Obama was president, when you were in Downing Street. There was cooperation. We saw it during the financial crisis of 2008-9, and people thought, okay, we just have this human roadblock there in the form of Donald Trump. Get him out of the way. As the questioner asked, what prospects does Biden offer for some renewed cooperation? And, is it possible that part of that renewed cooperation will just be Western nations sort of clubbing together to gang up against China in some kind of new Cold War?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to have worked with Joe Biden on a number of occasions. We went to Latin America during the financial crisis, so we've worked on a number of issues together. And I think what you see is what you get, and I think he is determined to make a difference. I think in many ways he's going to be more radical than the Obama presidency could actually be. I'll give you one example, which is nuclear weapons. Everybody thinks that issue is somehow over, and yet we've got this massive arms race taking place with Russia, now China joining, and of course we've got proliferation with North Korea, and there's a danger that Saudi Arabia and other countries are going to start to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, I say in the book a story that was really not reported for 10 years. We had to take, with America and Israel helping, we had to stop Syria developing a nuclear weapon. They were developing a nuclear weapon in 2007. And if you want a definition of just war, taking action to stop Syria becoming a nuclear weapons power, it meets all the tests of a just action. But Biden, I think he has a new chance. I mean, he has said there are 4 issues in nuclear weapons, just very briefly. One is you've got to stop nuclear testing because that's going to proliferate weapons, and he's in favor of that. And the second is you've got to stop enriching uranium and plutonium, and that's the issue with Iran as well, and he's in favor of that. The third is you've got to think of no first use, that no country will use nuclear weapons first, and we could get an agreement on that, then that would be a de-escalation of tension. And then you've got to get some agreement that unless you're attacked by nuclear weapons, you will never use nuclear weapons. So you get to a position where nuclear wars cannot be won and they will also never be fought. And I think you could see a substantial reduction in our dependence on nuclear weapons. Now, we started that under a Labour government, and it's often forgotten. We reduced our nuclear warheads, and we were actually actively arguing for some nuclear weapons deal across the world. But with Joe Biden as president and with a more radical position from America, I do think things are possible. Now, how that brings in China and Russia is going to be the issue. But if the Western world is putting pressure by saying, look, we are prepared to take these steps to reduce our dependence on nuclear weapons, I think we would be putting pressure on Russia and China to do likewise. So again, I had huge arguments with China on human rights. I think they cut off relations with me for months because I met the Dalai Lama, and I recognized that we had a human rights dialogue with China, which seems to have stopped, which I think is a mistake. So I recognize all the difficult issues: Hong Kong, Tibet, China, what's happening to the religious minorities in China. But I do think you've got to be steadfast on these issues. But where cooperation is possible, you don't let the world fall into anarchy by refusing to get agreements where agreements are possible, like on climate change, possibly on nuclear weapons, and certainly on economic matters. These are things that we should be striving for.
We don't have much time left. I have 2 questions I want to ask you in our remaining time. The first is one that struck me on Monday, which is you were on the Today program talking actually about the pandemic and the need for a global vaccination effort, not just giving our leftover doses, but actually spending the money to vaccinate the world. The previous day, 24 hours earlier, Tony Blair had been on TV and the broadcast round talking about how those who are doubly vaccinated should be allowed more freedoms. And it just struck me that here were two people who were the dominant figures in politics nearly a quarter of a century ago. In 1997 was when, so that's 24 years ago, who were still towering figures in British politics. And then you look at everything that's happened in Labour since. And I thought to myself, is that to some extent on both of you, on you and Tony Blair, that you didn't have a succession strategy? You didn't raise the next generation to come up behind you. So instead, we have these two huge figures who are still huge, but then a succession of people afterwards who did not succeed. And is that to some extent on both of you?
Well, I've got to take all the blame that is necessary if we failed to help Labour become successful in the last 10, 11 years. But you've got to look at what was happening. I mean, we had the Iraq War. I've already written that I was certainly misled about what happened over Iraq, and I regret that. But I tried to get us out of Iraq as quickly as possible, and we were out 3 years before the Americans.
Misled by whom?
I think the Americans, or at least a section of the Americans, knew exactly what was happening over weapons in Iraq, and I've said this, and I've set out my reasons for that. But that was draining support from Labour. And even though I, in 2007, said we're going to get out as quickly as possible, and we got out within a few months, it wasn't good enough for many people in the electorate who thought a big mistake had been made over the claiming that weapons existed where they didn't. Then we had, you have cycles where I could see in 2005, 2006, people were turning against the need to pay taxes for the health service and other services that we needed to do. So that you have a cycle where collective action is embraced, and then people move towards wanting more individualistic approaches. So there are trends in politics that you've got to understand and you've got to try to overcome. But yes, Labour will come back because our values actually still represent the best values of the British people. And I don't think there's anybody watching this evening who's got progressive views who doesn't think that the British people are capable of being persuaded that as long as you have the right policies that reflect these values, these are the values they would prefer to embrace. And so my book ends with a message of hope, and hope because I think younger people I see, they see the mistakes that have been made. They've had to live through, in the last 10 years, a financial crisis, austerity, Brexit, climate change, and now a pandemic. And they see the problems that need to be addressed. And I've got some hope that this new generation will actually learn from any mistakes we've made and actually make a huge difference. And I've also got hope because I do see that people respond to messages where you can actually create a better society. You can actually work together to create a better community. And we have got to, as you said at the beginning, tell stories about that show that where cooperation happens and solidarity exists, then it really does work to change things. And, I end my book with a lot of stories that emphasize to me the importance that people attach to what The Guardian is now talking about. And I talk about, my chapter is called The Power of Hope. And it is hope about a better future that drives us on. I just end with Tennyson because I quote Tennyson because Tennyson, late in life, Tennyson said, he wrote this poem, Locksley Hall, 40 years on. He said, "Oh, cosmos, chaos, chaos, commons, when will it ever end?" And total despair. And Gladstone, the Prime Minister, wrote to him at the time, said, "This is ridiculous. You wrote a poem 40 years ago called Locksley Hall, which said, dipped into the future as far as the eye could see and saw the vision of the world and the wonder it could be. Why do you not talk about the possibilities, about hope, and about the potential for our society?" And of course, Ulysses, to seek, to strive, to yield, to find and not to yield. And we should never yield to nationalism and protectionism and xenophobia and isolationism and sectarianism and to these culture wars that people are trying to impose on our society. We should actually strive to create this fairer, greener, healthier, better society.
The other question I had in my mind was prompted a little bit by, of all people, David Cameron, who, when he appeared before that committee to talk about Greensill, said he had no guide as to how to be an ex-prime minister. He didn't know that perhaps there needed to be a sort of committee of elders to tell people how to be an ex-prime minister. And I wondered, I come across people a lot who say, look, I'm not, say what you like about Gordon Brown's time as prime minister. He, as an ex-prime minister, he has conducted himself with great integrity. You haven't gone around the world making a ton of money by working for various dodgy regimes. You didn't go and work for an equivalent of Greensill and try and line your pocket. I think it's known that you basically don't take the prime ministerial pension you could have taken. I don't think you do any kind of commercial work. Instead, you're a UN envoy for girls' education. You've written this book. Even there, I think the proceeds go to your foundation. Who did you have in you? Did you think hard about what kind of ex-PM you would be? Did you have a model in mind? I wonder sometimes if you have looked at the ex-presidency of Jimmy Carter and thought you might be an ex-prime minister like him. But you tell me, how have you, I don't think you do anything by accident, Gordon Brown. I think you plan things. So how have you approached this part of your life?
Look, I think I've got the same values that I had when I was in office. So I don't feel that there's a huge distinction between what I was trying to do in government and what I'm trying to do now, although other people may dismiss what I did in government, and I understand that. But I've always thought that if you're in public service, you stay in public service. You can't use public service as a platform for private gain. And therefore, I would have very tough rules about taking on commercial work after you leave office, about conflicts of interest and all this kind of things that are causing this government real problems. You have to have clear rules. You've made up your mind to be a public servant, and you can't use the fact that you've been a public servant and the information you get to make money elsewhere. That seems to me to be in contradiction of the vows you've taken when you actually go into the public service. And I've tried to do charitable work because I think that I can use some of my experience to make a difference. But obviously, the ability to change things depends on a new generation of people that I hope I can help coming up in public life that can make a difference. So perhaps the things that I'm doing, I'm trying to persuade other people. The person I've admired most in all the time I've been in politics is Nelson Mandela, because I met him, before he was president, after he was president. I met him in very late in his life, before he died. And I always had a really good relationship with him. And he taught me that you cannot be bitter, because he told all the people when they were coming out as the ANC prisoners, if you take revenge, it will be a bloodbath. You've got to reconcile. There's got to be reconciliation. And he was a modest man till the day he died. And he used to say, "You're the representative of the British Empire." He used to say to me, he was a modest man. I remember, I just tell you one story which just finishes it off. He told me about how he tried to get the Queen to invite one of his friends to Buckingham Palace. It was an African reign princess. And he said he'd phoned up the Queen out of frustration that he hadn't got an answer from Buckingham Palace. And when he told me the conversation, I just couldn't. He started off, "Hello, Elizabeth." Now, nobody calls the Queen Elizabeth. And then he said, "How's the Duke?" And all this. Anyway, he didn't get his way. But Mandela was a really modest man. And a lot, I think, of people would like to follow some of the advice he gave us.
Well, your book is full of advice for the world, for us, for Guardian readers. Thank you for celebrating with us tonight the 200th anniversary of The Guardian. The book is called 7 Ways to Change the World. It is by our very special guest tonight. If we were all in the room, I think there would be a very warm round of applause, but instead, virtually, our thanks to you, Gordon Brown.
And thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for watching, and good night.